What's going on guys, Jin here. This is a Frozen Orb endgame speed farming guide, and it is basically designed to get your foot in the door for endgame farming with minimal equipment. Even without any uniques, it can clear up to tier 80 pits, and you don't even need anywhere near perfect affixes or any masterworking. So it'll let you get a lot of gear very quickly. It's especially helpful if you're playing mostly solo. So if you like guides like this, consider liking, subscribing and hitting the bell, and leaving a comment as it helps out the algorithm and helps out the channel a lot. Super appreciated, so thank you, and let's get to the build. So for the skill tree, we're going to take 2 into Firebolt. Then we're going to take 5 into Frozen Orb, and go for Greater Frozen Orb. Then we're going to take 1 into Devastation, and 3 into Elemental Dominance. In our defensive skills, we're taking 1 into Flame Shield, 3 into Teleport, and we're going to go for the Shimmering Teleport. Then we're going to take 3 into Glass Cannon, and 1 into Elemental Attunement. We're also going to take 1 into Ice Armor, and go for the Shimmering Ice Armor. In our Conjuration skills, we're going to take 1 into Ice Blades, and go for Summoned Ice Blades. We're going to go for Lightning Spear, with Invoked Lightning Spear. Then we're going to take 3 into Conjuration Mastery, 1 into Align the Elements, 3 into Mana Shield, and 2 into Protection. Then we come down to our Mastery skills. We're going to take 1 into Inner Flames, and 3 into Devouring Blaze. Then in our ultimate skills, we're just going to take the 3 into Permafrost, Hoarfrost, Frigid Breeze, and Icy Touch. And in our key passives, we're just going to take Veer's Mastery. So that wraps it up for the skill tree. Next up we have the Paragon Board. So for the Paragon Board, in the first board we're going to put the Tactician Glyph. Then we're going to go up to our second board, the Icefall board, making sure we take the Legendary Node, and we're going to use the Winter Glyph. For our third board, we're going to use the Enchantment Master board, and we're going to put in the Elementalist Glyph. For our fourth board, we're going to go with the Burning Instinct board, and we're going to use the Destruction Glyph. For our fifth board, we're going to go for the Frigid Fate board, again taking a Legendary Node here, and we're going to put in the Unleash Glyph. For our sixth board, we're going to go for the Ceaseless Conduit board, and we're going to put in the Exploit Glyph. And for our seventh board, we're going to go for the Elemental Summoner board, and we're going to take the Legendary Node once again, and we're going to put in the Flame Theater Glyph. So really straightforward Paragon board there. All of this is going to be in the build planner. That'll be linked in the description below, and that'll have all of the skills, Paragon board, gear, etc. Next up for the enchantments. So for the enchantments, we're just going to use Frozen Orb as our first one. So whenever we cast a non-basic skill, we have a 30% chance to launch a Frozen Orb at a nearby enemy. And for our second enchantment, we've got Firebolt, so direct damage from skills, applies burning damage over 8 seconds. That will allow us to proc our Flame Theater Glyph, and to use our Devouring Blaze passive. Next up we have the gear. So for the gear, on the left I'm going to list the tempering and the affixes that you would want to get, and let's start with the Helm. So we're going to go for a Godslayer crown here. That's going to give us all stats, max life, damage to elites, and cooldown reduction. But also when we stun, freeze, or immobilize an elite, we pull in all nearby enemies and deal 30 to 60% increased damage to them for 3 seconds. That has a 12-second cooldown. But against bosses, this effect will trigger whenever we deal damage instead. This helm is really good. We want to masterwork the cooldown reduction on it. If you don't have access to this, no problem, just use a normal helm with intelligence, cooldown reduction, and mana per second. Temper that with max life and like a hit percent chance to immobilize, and try and masterwork the cooldown reduction. As for the aspect, you would want to use Everliving, so you take 10 to 25% less damage from CC'd or vulnerable enemies. Next up, we have the chess piece. We're going to use a normal chess piece with intelligence, mana per second, and armor. You would want to temper that with total armor and lucky hit percent chance to freeze. As for the masterworking, try and masterwork that mana per second. And for the aspect, you would use the aspect of concentration. So casting a conjuration skill grants you 15 to 25% damage reduction for 5 seconds. Next up we have the gloves. We're going to look for some gloves with crit chance, frozen orb, and attack speed. And we're going to temper that with crit strike damage and lucky hit percent to stun. If you can't get ranks into frozen orb, ranks into core skills will work slightly less efficiently. As you can see, I also don't have the attack speed, but no problem. We're going to try and masterwork the frozen orb or core skill ranks here. As for the aspect, we're going to go for shredding blades, so ice blade's chance to apply vulnerable is increased by 20%, and that duration is increased by 4 seconds. We also gain 15 to 30% vulnerable damage. Next up we have the pants. We're going for Tibault's Will. We get all stats, max life, max resource, and damage reduction whilst unstoppable, but also we deal 10 to 20% increased damage while unstoppable and for 5 seconds after. When we become unstoppable, we also gain 50 of our primary resource. We're going to try and masterwork the max life. If you don't have access to Tibault's Will, you would use some pants with intelligence, max life, and armor, and temper that with max life and lucky hit percent chance to slow. As for the aspect, you would want to use Mage-Lords here. So the Veer's Mastery Key passive will grant you 6 to 9% damage reduction, tripled while fighting a close enemy. Next up we have the boots. We're going to go for Esu's Heirloom. That gives us move speed, movement speed for 7 seconds after killing an elite, crit strike damage, and resist all. Also, our critical strike chance is increased by 20 to 40% of our move speed bonus. So that is quite a big boost there, especially if you get a higher end roll. As for the masterworking, you want to try and masterwork the crit strike damage or the movement speed. If you don't have access to Esu's Heirloom, you would want to use normal boots with intelligence, mana per second, and movement speed or armor, depending on what you're lacking there armor wise. And you would want to temper that with teleport cooldown reduction or movement speed, and crowd control duration. As for the aspect, you would want to use concussive strikes, so on lucky hit, damaging an enemy has up to 20% chance to daze for 2 seconds, and you deal 5 to 20% increased damage to dazed enemies. And you would want to masterwork the mana per second. Next up we have the main hand. We're just going to use a wand here, if we can, as that has the built-in vulnerable damage, and we're looking for intelligence, crit strike damage, and damage or max life. As for the tempering, we're going to go for the chance for frozen orb to cast twice, and crit strike damage. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork that frozen orb projectiles to cast twice. Aspect wise, we're going to be using Storm Swell, so we deal 15 to 30% increased damage to vulnerable whilst we have a barrier. Next up, the offhand, we're going to be looking for something with intelligence, crit chance, and cooldown reduction. And for tempering, we're going to go for frozen orb projectiles to cast twice, and crit strike damage. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork that frozen orb projectiles casting twice. And for the aspect, we're using Conceited, so that'll let us deal 10 to 25% increased damage while we have a barrier active. So next up we have the Amulet. We're going to be using a Fractured Winterglass. That gives us non-physical damage, chance for Frozen Orb to cast twice, Conjuration cooldown reduction when Frozen Orb explodes, and ranks into Conjuration Mastery. Also, casting a Frozen Orb has a 35 to 65% chance to spawn a random Conjuration when it explodes, and on lucky hit, our Conjurations have up to a 50 to 90% chance to launch a Frozen Orb at nearby enemies. You would want to try and masterwork the Conjuration Mastery here. If you don't have access to a Fractured Winterglass, you would use an Amulet with crit chance, cooldown reduction, and ranks into Hoarfrost or Devouring Blaze. And you would temper that with crit strike damage and resource cost reduction. As for the masterworking, you would want to try and masterwork the Hoarfrost or Devouring Blaze ranks. And for the aspect, you would use the aspect of Frozen Orbit. So Frozen Orb will explode 2 additional times at its destination for 45 to 60% of its damage. And as it would be on the Amulet, it would be increased by 50%. So next up we have the rings. We're going to be using Talrash's Iridescent Loop as our first. That gives us lucky hit chance, non-physical damage, cooldown reduction, and ranks into potent warding. Also, for each type of elemental damage we deal, we gain 10 to 20% increased damage for 4 seconds, up to 40 to 80% depending on your role. And dealing any elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. For our secondary ring, we're just using a normal ring with intelligence, attack speed, and crit strike chance. We're going to temper that with resource cost reduction and crit strike damage. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the attack speed, and for the aspect we're going to be using Frozen Orbit here. And if Frozen Orbit is on the necklace, then you would use accelerating, so critical strikes with core skills increase your attack speed by 10 to 25% for 5 seconds. If you don't have access to a Tal Rasha's Iridescent loop, you would use a duplicate of this ring, and you would want to use the aspect of control here, so you deal 20 to 35% more damage to immobilize, stunned or frozen enemies. As for the gems, we're going to be using skulls in the jewellery. We're going to be using the emeralds or the sapphires in the weapons. I think the sapphires might be slightly better. And for the armor, we're going to be using the rubies for that max life. So that pretty much wraps up the build. Thanks a lot for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you made it this far or you learned something from the video, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Leave a comment down below as it helps the algorithm out, and it really helps out the channel a lot. So that's much appreciated. Thank you very much. And I'll leave you with some more Frozen Orbing now, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!